Spooks Incorporated. The house was enclosed in darkness, and Miss Peeble was alone. She had been alone for 60 years. She had no family, and there was no one to care for her or help her. And now she was scared, but it was no good calling out. She was alone in the night. She loved her old house. She had lived in it all her life. She loved the old veranda and the tin roof. She loved the old cellar under the ground. She loved everything about it. It was her home. A few days earlier, a shifty-looking character had offered her a lot of money for the old cottage, but Miss Peeble wouldn't sell. She wanted to live in the house until she died. People said there was a ghost in the house. They said Ned Kelly had once lived there many years ago, before he had been hanged for murder and robbery. Some people said that Ned's ghost walked at night, moaning and groaning and wearing the steel armour and helmet that he had made to protect himself from the bullets of the police. Miss Peeble didn't believe it. She didn't believe the house was haunted. She had never heard any moaning in the night, not until now. She sat up in bed. There was something in the house. She could hear movement. It sounded like someone crying. The noise was coming from the kitchen. It was very soft. She told herself not to be silly. There was nothing there. It was just her nerves. But she could feel her hands shaking in the dark. She wanted to turn on the light and go and look. She knew she couldn't go to sleep until she had checked in the kitchen, but she was too scared. So she lay there all alone in the dark. The noise grew louder. It was coming closer, coming along the hall. Miss Peeble heard clinking and clanking. It sounded like chains being dragged along. Something was coming towards her room. It was definitely moaning and groaning and clinking and clanking. Miss Peeble gave a little sob. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shout for help, but she didn't. She lay there saying nothing, hoping it would go away. The noise came closer and closer. The light appeared under the bedroom door. Soft flickering light, like light from a candle. Miss Peeble gasped. Her heart beat quickly and her head started to spin, and then the door began to open. Slowly. Light flickered into the room. Slowly, slowly the door opened, and there in the dark hall he stood, the ghost of Ned Kelly. He had a steel helmet over his head with a slit cut out for his eyes. His chest was covered with steel plates. In one hand was a candle, and in the other was a revolver. Green eyes glowed through his helmet. Miss Peeble froze. Her heart almost stopped with fear. Ned Kelly started to walk towards the bed. He moaned, his armour creaking. He stretched out a hand for Miss Peeble, a long, skinny hand. Then the candle went out. It was completely black. Miss Peeble screamed. She put her hands to her mouth and screamed and screamed. Then she jumped out of bed. She stumbled through the darkness, out into the hall, out through the front door. It was raining outside. It was freezing cold, but Miss Peeble didn't care. She ran out into the street screaming. She was soaking wet and her bare feet were cut and bleeding. She fled down the road and into the dark night. Ned was alone in the bedroom. He walked over to the door and switched on the light. Then he looked at his watch. It was a digital watch. It said 12:45 a.m. The figure pulled off his hood. It wasn't Ned Kelly at all, and he wasn't a ghost. He was a young man, a teenager. He laughed to himself. "That will make the old bag sell the house," he said, "or my name is not Mick Harris." The next night, in another town, an old man was locking up a church. His name was Mr. Pickle. All the others had gone. Choir practice was over. It was dark outside and cold. He put his hat on his bald head and shivered. He wished he was home having his supper of cheese and biscuits and a nice glass of port. He thought of the warm fire at home and his favourite TV show, a country practice. He decided to hurry back. He took the short cut home through the graveyard. The graves were old and the grass was long. that there was a little track that went past his mother's grave. Mr. Pickle looked after her grave. He kept it tidy and he put flowers on it every Sunday after church. But tonight it was windy and cold and dark. He took his hat off as he passed his mother's grave, but he kept walking. Then he stopped. Something was different. The flower bowl had gone. He turned round and went back to the grave. The moon went behind a cloud. The night grew even darker, and it was hard to see. Mr. Pickle bent down and looked at the grass on the grave. His heart almost stopped. He saw something terrible. The grass moved. He was sure the grass had moved. He took a step back. The grass on the grave was moving up and down. He was filled with horror. There was a scraping noise like digging. Something was digging its way out of the grave. Suddenly a small hole appeared, and out of it came the bones of a hand. The skeleton of a hand and an arm appeared and waved around. On one finger was a wedding ring. Mr. Pickle was filled with fear. He opened and closed his mouth. "No, no," he screamed. He took a step backwards. Then he felt a sharp pain in his chest and down his arm. He put his hand over his heart. The pain grew worse. It was killing him. He fell to the ground and lay still. A man ran out from behind a tree. It was a fat man dressed in a suit. He bent over Mr. Pickle. He put his head on Mr. Pickle's chest and listened. Then he picked up Mr. Pickle's arm and felt his wrist. There was no pulse. The skeleton was still waving around in the hole. The man in the suit ran over to it. He pulled out the arm and threw it on the ground. A moan came out of the hole. "Shut up, Mick, you fool," said the man. "Pickle is dead. He's croaked. We've gone too far this time." The man grabbed a shovel. He started to dig in the grave. He uncovered a long box. Then he opened the lid and a young man sat up, a teenager. "What's up, Shifty?" he said. "You're a fool. That's what's up," said Shifty. "He's dead. Mr. Pickle is dead as a doornail, and it's your fault." "It was your idea, not mine," said the teenager. "Listen, Mick," said Shifty. "I told you to get in the box. I told you to wave the skeleton hand, but I didn't tell you to put a ring on the finger. He thought it was his mother's ring. It was too much for him. It gave him a heart attack. Now he's dead." "Don't try to blame me," said Mick, "or I'll flatten you." "Okay, don't get ants in your pants. Let's get out of here before someone comes." Shifty and Mick ran back to the road. They got into the old truck. On the side it said, "Spooks for hire." Mick and Shifty drove home quickly. They wanted to get away from Mr. Pickle's body. They didn't want to get caught. The two men ran a business called Spooks Incorporated. They dressed up as ghosts to frighten people. They went to old houses that were supposed to be haunted and scared the owners so that they sold their homes. Mick and Shifty's friends bought the houses cheap, then paid the two crooks for what they had done. "Will we get paid now?" said Mr. Pickle. "That Mr. Pickle is dead," said Mick. "We were only supposed to scare him, not kill him." "Of course we'll get paid," said Shifty. "His house will have to be sold now. Dead men don't own houses. This has been a good week. Last night we scared the daylights out of old Miss Peeble, and tonight we knocked off Mr. Pickle. We get $1,000 for each, $2,000 for 2 nights' work. That's good money, real good." "What's the next job?" said Mick. "Who do we scare next?" "There's a pub in Melbourne called Young and Jackson's," replied Shifty. "It's supposed to be haunted. We are going to scare the owner into selling it for a cheap price." "Tell me the story about the ghost in the pub," said Mick. "Not that I believe in ghosts. Only fools believe in ghosts." "Well," Shifty said, "a long time ago, a bloke called John Hart owned Young and Jackson's. He wanted to see if he could stop meat going bad. So he got a chicken and chopped off its head. Then he filled the chicken up with salt. He thought that filling the chicken up with salt would stop it going rotten. Did it work?" No one knows," said Shifty. "He cut himself while he was chopping off the cook's head, and the next day he died." "And now his ghost is supposed to haunt the pub," said Mick. "No," yelled Shifty, "the ghost of the headless chicken is supposed to haunt the pub." Mick and Shifty started to laugh. They both thought it was funny, very funny indeed. The next day, Mick and Shifty made their plans. They were going to spook the owner of the pub so that he would get scared and sell it. "How are we going to get the ghost of a headless chicken?" said Mick. "Dressing up as Ned Kelly was a good idea. That scared people. But can't dress up as a chicken. I'm too big." "We're going to make one," said Shifty. "We're going to make a headless chicken?" Mick and Shifty spent 10 days making a mechanical chicken. They used feathers, wheels, a small motor, and they put red paint around the neck to look like blood. At least it was finished. Shifty put it on the floor. "Terrific," he said. "It looks just like the real thing. The owners of the pub will be scared out of their wits." "Let's see if it can walk," said Mick. "Press the remote control." Shifty pressed a button and the headless chicken ran around in circles. It flapped its wings and shook its headless neck. "Wonderful," Mick went on. "In the dark it will look just like the real thing, the ghost of the headless cook. Something is missing, though. It's good, but it needs something else." He looked at the mechanical chicken for a while, then he said, "I know. It needs to make a noise. It needs to cluck." "Don't be a fool. How can it cluck?" Shifty replied. "It's got no head." "A chook can't cluck without a head." "That's all the better," Mick told him. "Don't you see? A chicken with no head that makes a noise is more scary. It will be more ghostly if it clucks. All we have to do is put a tape recorder inside it. You can make some clucking noises, and I will put them on the tape. Then we put the tape inside the chicken." "Great," yelled Shifty. "A terrific idea. You go and get a blank tape, and I'll find a small tape recorder." A few minutes later, Shifty came back holding a cassette recorder. "I can't find a blank tape," he said, "but this is an old tape with folk songs on it. We can tape the chicken noises over the top." Mick put the tape in the recorder and pressed the record button. Shifty started to cluck like a chicken. "Wonderful," said Mick. "You sound just like the real thing." After a while he stopped, and the tape recorder that will do the trick. That should be enough clucking to scare anyone to death. They put the mechanical chicken on the floor and started it up. Once again it ran around in circles and flapped its wings, but this time it clucked as well. "Fantastic," shouted Mick. "That tape sounds just like a chicken." That night Mick and Shifty crept down to Young and Jackson's pub. They waited outside at midnight and the lights went out. The back door opened. The landlord came out carrying a rubbish bin. "This is it," said Mick. "This is where we give the proper sucker the fright of his life." He put the mechanical chicken in the footpath and hid behind a fence. The chicken ran out onto the road. It flapped its wings and clucked. Red paint dripped from its neck. The landlord just stood there holding the bin. He couldn't believe his eyes. Then he groaned. "It's true," he said. "The story is true. It's the ghost of the headless chicken." His knees knocked together. His hands shook. He tried to run, but he couldn't. He was glued to the spot. The chicken kept running in circles, clucking loudly. Mick whispered to Shifty, "Let it go for a while. Give him a good scare. Then we might not have to come back again." The two crooks peeked around the fence. They laughed to themselves. They thought it was a great joke. The landlord was so scared he couldn't move. After a while Mick stepped out into the path. He pretended he was just walking along the street. The poor landlord saw him. "Look," the landlord managed to say, "the ghost of the headless chicken." "Where?" said Mick. "I can't see anything." There was a trick he often used. He pretended not to see the chicken, even though it was flapping and clucking right in front of him. The landlord leaned against the wall. His face was white. He looked as if he was going to faint, but before he did, something happened. The chicken started to sing. It ran around flapping its wings and singing. It sang, "There was an wild colonial youth, Jack Doolan was his name. Of poor but honest parents, he was born in Castlemaine." "You fool," Shifty yelled Mick. "You didn't wipe all the folk songs off the tape." Shifty put his head around the corner. The chicken went quiet for a second, but it kept running around. Then it started up again. "I'll fight, but I won't surrender," said the wild colonial boy. The landlord stared at the chicken. Then he stared at Mick and Shifty. "A trick!" he yelled. "A dirty, rotten trick!" He ran over to the mechanical chicken and picked it up. He saw it had wheels. He threw it on the ground with angry roar. Then he turned to Mick and Shifty. The landlord was a big man, very big. "I'll teach you ratbags a lesson," he shouted. "I'll get you for this." Mick and Shifty turned and ran. They ran for their lives. Down the street they went faster and faster, but the landlord followed them, and after him came the chicken. The landlord started to slow down. He couldn't keep up, but the chicken could. It passed him and followed Shifty and Mick down the street. It was flapping its wings and clucking its head off. The chase went on for quite a while, but eventually the landlord gave up. He shook his fist at the two men and the chicken and turned round and went back towards Young and Jackson's pub. Mick looked over his shoulder. "It's all right," he said, puffing. "He's gone back." Then Mick noticed the chicken. "Well, look at that. The stupid mechanical chicken has come after us. I thought it was supposed to run around in circles." They both looked at the chicken. It was flapping its wings and moving up and down on its legs. "Hey," yelled Shifty, "when did you put those legs on the chicken?" "I didn't." "No, it had legs." The headless chicken sat down on the footpath. Then it stood up. There was something underneath it. "An egg," screamed Shifty. "It's laid an egg!" His eyes almost popped out of his head. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He bent down to pick up the egg, but his fingers couldn't grab it. He couldn't pick it up. He could see right through it. The egg was transparent. "Ah!" he screamed. "It's a ghost egg!" "Rubbish!" shouted Mick. "I'm sick of this." He ran at the chicken and kicked at it. His leg passed through the chicken and he fell flat on his back. The chicken sat there clucking. It wasn't hurt at all. They both stood there looking at it. The moon came out. This time it was Mick who screamed. "Ah! I can see through it and there's no messing inside it. It's salt. That's not our chicken. It's the ghost. It's the ghost of the real chicken." For a second they just stood there. They were too scared to move. Then the chicken flapped up onto Mick's shoulders. Like drops of blood fell from its headless neck. Both men screamed together. They turned and ran for their lives. Down the streets and through lanes they fled, and close behind followed the ghostly chicken. At last they reached the river. Shifty was puffing. He was out of breath. "Quick!" he grunted. "Down there! Down these steps!" They ran down some steps that led to the Yarra River. There was a rowboat at the bottom. The chicken was right behind them. They jumped into the little boat and floated out into the river. Shifty took one oar and Mick took the other. Soon they were well out in the deep water. "It can't follow us here," said Mick. "We're safe now." But he was wrong. Sitting on the back of the boat, still clucking, was the ghost of the headless chicken. Mick stood up and started to scream. "Sit down, you fool," Shifty said. "You're rocking the boat." The boat started to rock from side to side. Mick grabbed at the edges and the little boat tipped over. Mick and Shifty disappeared under the cold, black water. Neither of them could swim. The landlord of the pub arrived home. On the footpath he found the mechanical chicken. Its battery had run out and it lay there in the footpath. He went over to the chicken and jumped up and down on it. Then he threw the broken pieces of the wheels and the wire in the bin. The next morning, while he was walking by the river, the landlord found two dead men in the mud. They say that if you go down to the Yarra River on a dark night, you hear Young and Jackson's pub, you see two ghostly men in a boat. They are rowing as fast as they can. They are scared out of their wits, because in the back of the boat sits the ghost of two headless chickens. One of the chickens is stuffed with salt. The other chicken is singing the wild colonial boy at the top of its voice.